Hello friends, welcome back to Heartscapes, where we are learning and practicing the system of Reiki at the intersection of self-reflection, spiritual practice, and social action. My name is Michaela, and I'm really glad to have you back here with me today. One of the topics that I talk about on this channel a lot and speak to in coursework is the subject of being trauma-informed in our Reiki practice. And I teach a class specifically for Reiki practitioners on how to cultivate a trauma-informed perspective inside of our practice. For today's video, though, I wanted to speak specifically to clients of Reiki practitioners or those who might be seeking Reiki sessions and who might wish to choose a practitioner who has some form of trauma-informed perspective in their practice. To talk about things to look for, things to ask, and ways in which we can support those who are choosing to be trauma-informed in their practice. This might be because we ourselves are carrying around some form of trauma that we know we need our practitioners, those who hold us in an intimate context like a medical practice or a Reiki session, to have an understanding of that and to have cultivated a understanding of trauma into their protocols and their practices and their mindsets. Or it might simply be because we want to, we see the value of having this kind of perspective out there in the world, and we want to support those who are doing it actively in their practice. Whatever the reason that we might be seeking a trauma-informed Reiki practitioner, I wanted to just give us a few guidelines to work with to help us to find those people. So in this video, I'm going to just go over 3 such guidelines, questions that you can ask, things you can look for when you are selecting your practitioner. So first off, I wanted to just get a shared understanding of what I mean when I talk about being trauma-informed. So when I talk about being trauma-informed, I simply mean that we are holding an awareness that many people, in society, many of us have had some form of traumatic event happening in our past. In fact, most people will have some form of traumatic event happen to us in the course of our lifetime. We are vulnerable bodies in a complicated world, and there's many different ways in which we can be challenged. And for some of us, that trauma gets stuck in our body in certain ways. It doesn't get fully processed or integrated into our experience. And as a result, there can be moments in our life after that traumatic event that trigger or remind us of the event, and that kind of spark the physiological response that happens when we are in a very frightening or dangerous situation. In simple terms, our fight, flight, or freeze response that gets kicked up. And when something happens that's outside of our control, that somehow reminds us of that traumatic event that we have not yet integrated into our experience, so it's still stuck in our body in some way, we can go into the feelings of some version of what we felt when we were in that experience. Often fear or anger or the need to run away or to freeze up, to hide. Just many of the responses that we have to a frightening or dangerous experience can get triggered inside of experiences that are not inherently frightening or dangerous. And so as we come to understand this dynamic more and more, just as a society, there's been tremendous breakthroughs and advancement in our understanding of trauma, our ability to monitor what's happening in the brain and the connection between the brain and the body, and therefore how trauma actually works when it is embedded in the body. We've just learned so much more about that as a society over the last 25 years or so. We similarly have a much better understanding of how we can effectively treat trauma. And related to that, how we can effectively hold spaces that aren't necessarily about treating trauma, but that have the potential for triggering it. How we can hold those spaces in a way that lessen the possibility that a person's trauma might get triggered. Creating spaces that generate sense of safety, of trust, and a sense that a person is in control of their own experience, often by giving opportunities for choice and for consent about what happens to us inside of those spaces. There's been a lot of amazing work done in the realms of yoga and of meditation, both in terms of understanding how practices like that, like yoga and meditation, can be really powerful in the treatment of trauma, but more specifically for this video, how those spaces can be held in a way that avoids triggering trauma. And so I have studied those spaces quite a bit. I've studied the physiology of trauma for a long time, and I became very aware that inside of Reiki communities, we didn't really have anything like that. We didn't have anything, pointing us towards practices and mindset shifts that can help us to hold a space of safety, choice, consent, and trust in a way that is trauma informed. And so I've been working on creating those resources for our community. And in doing so, I've had some really amazing transformations inside of my own practice. And so that's what I've been wanting to bring to folks. And so when we are looking for somebody who is trauma informed, there's a couple of things to consider. Firstly, a lot of the practices and protocols and mindsets that I've identified as being kind of cornerstones of a trauma-informed practice, some of them are things that we can definitely come to in a kind of a common sense way without being specifically trained in being trauma-informed. And so you might be working with somebody who isn't specifically trained in trauma-informed Reiki or in trauma generally, but who has just on their own, through their own observation, their own experience, their own understanding of things, chosen to incorporate things that in effect make their practice trauma-informed anyway. So I say that because, while it's certainly helpful if a practitioner identifies that they have had training in being trauma-informed, if they don't have that training, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not creating a trauma-informed space. And so in order to find that out, we might need to ask some questions and to just pay attention to how they are communicating about their practice before the session. And then if we choose to be in a session, how they're conducting that session. And so those are some of the examples that I want to get into here. So of course, an obvious way is if a practitioner talks about being trauma-informed on their materials, on their website and such. That's, of course, a wonderful place to open the door to ask some questions about what they mean about that, how they hold that. But if we don't have that information, here are some things that you can look for. In my course, Cultivating a Trauma-Informed Reiki Practice, I identify 10 principles of being trauma-informed. And I'm just going to talk about 3 of them here in this video. One of the really important places to start, partly because it is a really clear example, very direct and easy to understand, but also because it's extremely important. It's a very important foundational one, is around the issue of touch. So a practitioner who is trauma-informed will present to you multiple options for how you receive your session, and specifically that you can receive it with or without gentle touch. Both of these options will be presented as equally good, equally normal. It won't be presented that touch is normal, but if you don't want to be touched, then you don't have to. You can see how that kind of sets up there's a normal way of doing things, but if you don't like the normal way, we can do it this special different way. We want to avoid, feeling like we're choosing something that's out of the ordinary. And so a skillful practitioner will offer those options as equally good and equally normal. The reason this is important is probably fairly obvious, but I'll state it anyway, which is that physical touch can be a very direct way of triggering a trauma, particularly if we're touched when we're not expecting it. And even inside of a session where there is some expectation that there will be touch, if our eyes are closed and we're just touched without being told that that's about to happen, there can be that sense of being startled, of being frightened, that can trigger feelings of being unsafe. And so, a skillful practitioner in this area will not only offer those options as both equally good and normal, but also just kind of talk us through, when and in what ways we might experience touch if we choose that. What I found to be true is that even if a person does want to be touched, that is part of their expectation and their desire inside of a session. still offering the option of not being touched, offering that they have the choice and they can give consent to whether or not they're touched, gives an extra layer of relaxation, an extra layer of trust, an extra layer of the client feeling empowered around their own experience. This is true, of course, not only in Reiki, but in other practices. In my last round with the Cultivating a Trauma-Informed Reiki class, I had a student who was a physical therapist, and she asked about that. She said, I really wish that there was something equal to that inside of physical therapy, where there was an option for a person to not have to deal with touch if they don't want to. But inside of that profession, touch is very important to how the services are delivered. And we talked about the value of offering or formally asking for consent to touch, even though there is this expectation that touch will occur. And so, formally asking the person, is it okay if I touch you now? After giving clearly laying out what that touch will look like in the context of the session. And so, just as many layers of being offered the opportunity to consent to what happens to us really impacts our nervous system, whether or not we're carrying trauma. This is true for anybody, right? And I should clarify that cultivating a trauma-informed Reiki practice, it's for everybody. Anybody who walks through our door should be given the courtesy of giving consent to being touched, for example. And so for any of us, when we are given that opportunity to say, yes, I agree to this, and I agree that we're going to start this process, it helps the nervous system relax. It helps to settle us down and to settle us into a space of collaboration with the practitioner, rather than simply submitting ourselves to whatever it is that's going to happen in the session. So that's the first one. Looking out for practitioners who normalize receiving Reiki without touch and always give that option to everybody who comes through the door. Secondly, and this one kind of flows from the first, related to this concept of consent, is do our practitioners. Secondly, related to this concept of giving consent to touch, the second thing that I would suggest that people look for in a trauma-informed Reiki practitioner is, do they offer you multiple modifications to the elements that they include in their session? And so going beyond touch or no touch, oftentimes Reiki practitioners will include other elements in the session. That could include using scented oils or an eye pillow, or sound elements, or even opening the window, modifications to the physical space that the session is happening in. And oftentimes, and this has been, I have done this as well before I was more mindful of it. I've experienced this myself as a client in Reiki sessions and in other types of sessions. Oftentimes, we craft our sessions in a way that reflects what would feel good to us. We want to create a supportive, enjoyable experience for our clients. And so we oftentimes think very carefully about what to include. And we include elements that we ourselves would find supportive, beautiful, relaxing, magical, whatever the feeling that we're wanting to impart to folks, right? We craft our sessions in a way that would feel good to us and that we assume will feel good to other people. But one of the principles inside of being trauma-informed is that what feels good to us doesn't necessarily feel good to everybody. And what feels bad to us doesn't necessarily feel bad to everybody. And so we can't assume that what we have to offer will be desired and good and well received by anybody. And again, this doesn't necessarily just have to do with trauma. A person might have chemical sensitivity, and so using scented oil could trigger that physiological condition and cause them to feel sick, right? Taking a simple moment to describe optional elements to include in the session and giving the person the opportunity to consent or decline those elements is a really important part of setting up a session that feels safe and trusting. And so, I would look for a practitioner that clearly describes the elements that would be present in a session, or that you ask, what those elements might be, and they readily disclose that. And that give you a specific, explicit opportunity to consent or decline to those elements. On the one hand, this is a common courtesy, right? To give people information about what they're experiencing or to give them the opportunity. I've definitely had clients who actually preferred to be surprised, right? Just to be guided through the experience without being, told what was going to happen ahead of time. That's totally fine if that's what a person wants. But again, giving them the opportunity to consent to that or not is where we always want to start. So, are there modifications available for the elements that are presented, and are you given an opportunity to consent or decline to those elements? Would be the second recommendation. Lastly, and this one is a little bit less concrete, but it's one that really threads through the whole experience and really gets to ultimately what the outcome is that we're looking for in being trauma-informed in our practice. And that is, when you talk with your practitioner, when you experience the session with your practitioner, when you're asking them questions ahead of time to decide whether you're going to have a session with them, are you treated as the expert of your own experience? Or are you treated as a subject or a patient or somebody who is expected to kind of come in and submit to what the practitioner has to offer? Are you treated as the expert of your own experience? Now, this can show up in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's more of just a feeling, right? How you feel when you're in conversation with the person. But oftentimes there are specific things that people can say or do that make us feel, that they either do or do not essentially respect our own authority over our own experience and our own self-knowledge. You're the expert of what you are experiencing, right? A Reiki practitioner has expertise and knowledge. They've been trained in certain tools and techniques and practices that they have to offer, that they have to create a container within. But you are the expert of what you are experiencing, and you should be treated that way. And so just a few examples of how that might show up include, does the practitioner talk about healing, for example, which is a common framework to put inside of a Reiki practice? Do they talk about healing as originating from you or originating from them or originating from something outside of both of you? From my perspective, the thing that's the most true and also the most empowering is to orient towards healing as something that is generated inside of each of us. That a Reiki session is a place to hold a space for healing to occur, to bring resources into that space, to hold back the distractions of the day, the distractions of our daily life and our challenges and our stresses, so that our system, our body, our mind, our heart, our spirit, can take up the healing process that we know how to do, that we're built for. And therefore, any healing that happens inside of a Reiki session is coming from each individual person. It's not being enacted upon us by somebody else or something else outside of us. That's a fundamental mindset that we can cultivate that either does or does not get communicated. And so I would, if thinking about having a practitioner who's trauma informed, I would look for language that acknowledges you as the expert of your own experience, acknowledges that the healing that happens inside of the session comes from you. This also can play in the conversation that you might have with your practitioner after a session, where you might be comparing notes on what you experienced, what they experienced. You might have questions for them about what they noticed, or what's going on inside of the session. And again, this is a place for some subtlety, because oftentimes the impulse that we as practitioners might have is to overly explain and overly make meaning of what we've experienced. So we might experience certain sensations inside of the session. You might experience certain sensations inside of the session. There might be meaning to those experiences. There might not. There might be things that are very meaningful, and there might be things that simply pass by our experience. And a trauma-informed perspective would say that any meaning that gets made about the experiences that we have should come from each of us. So myself as a practitioner, I can make meaning for myself of experiences that I am having, but I shouldn't project that onto my client. I shouldn't say, well, I experienced this. I experienced feeling tingling sensations or heat, or I had an image come to my mind. And that means X, Y, and Z about you, the client. You see how that's a little different than I had this experience. Maybe it's meaningful to me, maybe it's not. I can tell you about that experience, but I'm going to try to avoid making meaning of it for you. Now, that's not to say we can't have a conversation about it. That isn't to say that I can't share with you the meaning that I might have for myself, and that might or might not have value to you. But again, if I'm regarding you as the expert of your own experience, then I'm going to lead with, guiding you to make your own meaning about what you experienced and even what I might have to report about the session. And then we can have an interesting conversation from there. What I found in kind of, asserting that with clients for many years is that there's this, first of all, there tends to be an expectation that I, as the practitioner, will share a lot of information about the person that I've just worked on. And that it often strikes people as a little bit odd that I tend to decline to make any meaning of that information. But once that surprise gets past, there's this sense of, again, empowerment, this sense of I'm in control of my own experience. I can make my own meaning. I maybe have a little bit of work to do to make that meaning moving forward. I often give people practices and exercises that they can do after the session that will help to integrate what they experienced and, again, make their own meaning. And, at the heart of this is that I believe, and I want to assert, and I want you to understand that you are the expert of your own experience, and that the greatest healing, insight, understanding, transformation is going to come when you are empowered to make that meaning for yourself. So those are the 3 things that I would recommend that you begin looking for if you're interested in finding a Reiki practitioner who is trauma-informed. Somebody who normalizes receiving Reiki with or without touch, offers both every time as good and right options. Somebody who informs you about potential elements of the session, modifications that might be available, and asks for your consent before offering any of these elements or making any changes. And thirdly, somebody who regards you as the expert of your own experience in whatever way that makes sense and has meaning for you. I guess the 4th, tip that would encompass all of these is to pay attention to how the communications between you and that practitioner go right from the beginning. Are they open to having a conversation with you before a session? Are they open to answering questions that you have? When you ask questions about some of these elements, how do they respond? Is there any defensiveness that comes up, or is it, are they very open to discussing these things? Are they surprised by any of these questions? Had they never considered whether or not to offer modifications and ask for consent? How do they receive those questions? So paying attention to the communications that you have with them so that you can understand what their perspectives are on these topics would be the kind of container that holds all of it. There are a number of different ways in which we as Reiki practitioners can shift our mindsets and incorporate practices and principles, protocols into our sessions that create a space that is trauma-informed. I just wanted to start with those 3 in this video. I hope that has been helpful to you. I hope that's helped you guide your thinking about how you might select a practitioner who is trauma-informed. I welcome your questions about anything in this content or anything that I haven't shared here. I'd really love to continue this conversation. I find it incredibly important to continue to expand a culture of safety, trust, consent, and choice inside of our Reiki communities. And so I'm really passionate about sharing this in a variety of contexts. So share your questions below, share your experiences with any of this below. And if there's somebody in your life that you think would be benefited by hearing about this perspective, please do share this video around. If you'd like to hear more from me, please go ahead and subscribe to this channel and receive notifications. You'll get an upload every time I share new content. And until the next time, I hope that wherever you go from here, you are deeply provisioned for your journey, for your experiences. And until next time, thank you so much for being here with me. I love you. Goodbye.